ask a lot of questions. And remember, these people do not pay tax. Not one bloody cent. They don't pay. And we have to ask a lot of questions. The government needs to be asked a lot of questions. Why did they allow that? Why did they let it go on? Why did they let... Who got the money for selling our banks, if they even sold them? Who did it? And nobody says a word. Now, just because they've been sold, that doesn't mean to say we can't ask questions. And we have got Chris, Ray and I Smith, Ray Platt. We can write to them. We can ask questions about any of these things. And they will print our letters. And what I want people to do is, you see somebody write a letter in, write your letter in too. Even in local papers. We can write our letter. We are allowed to ask questions. Making statements, you can get into trouble. But asking questions, and you can ask and ask and ask, and really keep things going. And this is the way it should be, and especially about who's paying tax. Now the other one is, who owns our mint? Nobody knows. I don't think we're in control of our mint at all. I think the same people print the money, it goes through their banks, and you wonder why they keep on saying that we owe all this money, the country owes all this money, we have to rely on our exports. Well, exports are very, very good, but for the infrastructure of a country, you should print your own money. It was done in the early days, and that's what started off Australia beautifully, was the infrastructure was being paid for. Roads, rail, hospitals, schools, anything to do with the public. A couple of conditions a man put on. Only done by Australians, and the money was printed for those jobs. Oh, and the timber, the steel, the concrete, all of everything to build them was paid from the mint. And the money went out round the people, and Australia grew rich. And I believe early last century, some multinationals came here and thought, boy, this place is rocking, we want to cut at this. And the government allowed it to happen. And they still are, and we seem to have the dumbest government ever. They just, anyone comes along who looks rich and wealthy, they welcome them. And they sold out Australia. It can be dragged back, but only with a lot of people asking a lot of irritating questions and more people building on that. So I'd ask you, please, write your letters, but don't make any statements. No statements, because when you make a statement, people say, oh, that couldn't be right. It couldn't possibly be right. But when you ask questions, they say, they wouldn't do that, would they? Would they? Well, it makes you think a bit, doesn't it? Why is this country in such a hell of a financial mess? It's a rich country. Very rich. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Maybe something very interesting. Very simple thing. When we lived actually in Carindale, here in Brisbane, our member of Parliament, Kevin Rudd, even said to me that it's better to write letters, not typewritten, but a handwritten letter to politicians are 10,000 to 25,000 votes worth. So each letter, because not many people write letters, first of all, but secondly, if you handwrite it, it will be read. That's his words.
Very good. And one other thing about a nice little tricky piece thing that they do with emails, receive, not read. Wipe it out. And they do that in an instant. And you're right, with a handwritten letter, much more powerful. Okay?
So let's thank Colleen Pepperell. By the way, all the youngsters here, Colleen sets a good example. Now, I'd like to call on our next speaker, Vivian Stott. Vivian comes from a property in the wilderness down in Lismore area, and he's talking about surviving the coming crisis. Let's welcome Vivian Stott.
Thanks very much. It's a real privilege to be here. It's a select group of people. You know, I guess there's been a fair bit of publicity about this organisation, but there are only a few people who are concerned. There are two things about that. One is it's a pity there aren't more people who are concerned, but the second thing is those of us who are concerned are special people. Don't think that just because you're one person or a small group you can't do anything. In fact, as you probably know, in history it always was a determined small group who made history. So you might think you just came across some of this knowledge you've heard today and got elsewhere by coincidence, but it's not coincidence. You've got something special, and I would advise you to use it, because it was, other people don't have it. Well, what I'd like to talk about today is, I think, in a very short period of time, Australia and all the other Western nations are going to be virtually unrecognisable. We're facing a challenge on many different levels: military, financial, spiritual, environmental, educational. As you probably know, there are a number of what they call failed states to the north of us. These are sort of Pacific Island kind of places. And we prop them up with money and with soldiers, but the fact of the matter is extremists are moving into these areas, including New Guinea, and coming into our borders. Our borders are very porous, not as bad as the Rio Grande, but not very good. On the economic front, we know that the money system is collapsing. The New York banks have just said, please give us $750,000 million, or there's going to be trouble. If you work this out, it comes to approximately $5,000 for every man, woman and child in that country, which is a country of 300 million people. So that's happening. On the environmental front, we know in places like Indonesia and Brazil, the forests are being just destroyed as we speak. Well, that's going to come here as well, because we have a great migration problem. We have forced mass third world migration into this country, and that brings with it the standards of justice, the standards of health, etc., which have been prevalent in those countries for a great length of time. Now, is it any coincidence that all the pillars of the house are falling down at once? No.
It took us about 3 hours to get that right.
See, my words are just being confirmed.
You're not coming across it on the speaker very well.
All right.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Did anybody at the back can't hear me?
Move forward a touch.
So the saddest thing is no one's really doing anything about all this, because we're our own worst enemy. We're the fault. We're at fault. We should know what's better. I'm not concerned about the bad guys, whether it's the international bankers or the media owners or the drug peddlers, etc. I'm concerned about the people who are supposed to be the good guys who aren't doing their job. That scares me witless. So I've got good news for the politicians, though. There is a group of men who is even more responsible for this mess than them, and that is our spiritual leaders. Now, we don't hear a lot about our spiritual leaders because our media hasn't been owned by us for the better part of a century. People who own the media are not your friend. You go to the media to get some publicity. You might as well go to the enemy in wartime to get a bit of help. So what do I mean by our spiritual leaders? Well, here we are, a bunch of people in a room, in a sort of a public hall with a swimming pool, and there's a big motorway going past, Australian people. But do we really understand what we're doing in life? Do we understand how we got here? Do we understand what happens after a life comes to an end? Do we understand what sort of rules we're supposed to be obeying in between? And, we have a religion, but that has greatly decayed. In 1960, I think a third of all people were going to some sort of spiritual service on a Sunday morning. That's gone from a third to down to about 3% or something like that. It's very small. And people think that that our religion is sort of a Jewish thing. But I'd like to tell you that that we, English-speaking and Northern European type people, are in fact the literal descendants of those 12 tribes in the Bible. And the people today in the Middle East who have a military occupation of what's ironically called the Holy Land, they're actually more like an imposter. They are people, if you study their history, who in the Middle Ages were forcibly converted to a religion called Judaism, which had been recently invented. They wrote their own Bible. So if what I'm saying is true, and we are the descendants of these 12 tribes, of King David, of Noah, of Adam, of the prophets, etc., then the laws that are in the Bible were given to us and are supposed to be our national laws. These laws include such things as land is to be distributed to every person without cost. We don't have that today. Usury or interest of any description is as serious an offence as murder. We're all committing that every time you go to the bank. You're committing that action. One day of the week is supposed to be a day off. Well, that's not happening. Even when the super intelligent being who created the planet wants to give us a holiday, we're too stubborn even to accept something for our own benefit. There are a number of other laws. For instance, we're not supposed to be letting temples and pagodas and all these things be put up in our country with other religions. We know that the immigration is this kind of a divide and conquer thing. It's bringing in people who don't fit in. We know they don't fit in. Yet we've all been told very surreptitiously that we mustn't say anything about it. We all know if we speak up, we're going to get into trouble. Yeah. So if you can't speak up now, my question is, what's it going to be like 5 years from now? I suggest you consider your future and your children, your grandchildren. You know, if there's a little flock of birds and a hawk flies over, any bird that sees the hawk will squawk. That bird gives away its position to save the flock. So that's something to consider. We're coming into a time now, we're running out of money, we're running out of water. You know, you can't even buy organic brown rice these days. It's not in the shops. We're having a bit of a food crisis. So we're coming into a time where there's going to be difficulty happening. You know, the Murray River isn't flowing down to the ocean anymore. The Great Barrier Reef is crumbling away. I mean, how many signs and portents and omens do we need before we realise we're actually in a serious time? You can kind of hypnotise yourself watching television at great length until you're a bit numb. But this isn't a television program. This is not a rehearsal. This is actually real life. So we need to think about the fact of how we're going to get by when there might not be electricity, or you might be a brownout. Instead of being bright fluoro lights, it'll be dim lamps. Instead of being a shop filled with lots of kinds of food, it might be pretty limited. Instead of being lots of petrol. I was in England 7 years ago. At that stage, petrol was $3. That was then.
Yeah, not more.
Yeah. So, again, it's a great privilege to talk to you, and I've brought some books along on some of these subjects if you want to get some more, and I'd just like to thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivian. Now, our next speaker is the wife of the minister that opened our conference with a prayer, and both of them have been very much involved in welfare, and Marie Edulji is talking today on mental health in Queensland. So let's welcome Marie.
Thank you, Dennis. Where's your chair?
I might need a chair,
You want a chair?
please.
Sure, we'll have one of those.
Thank you.
See that? When that goes down to zero,
My
we've got
time's
2
up.
minutes to go.
Okay.
2 minutes to go.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'll move the microphone down.
Could we move the chair forward just a little? I'll push it.
You'll push it?
Yeah.
All right, I'll sort of slide.
It's those rubber ends on the left.
Might be just the weight too. Good
That's
morning.
fine. Yeah. It picks
Sorry
up
about
well.
sorry about these hiccups. Couldn't get over the step in front there, so I had to be lifted up. But anyway, I'm Marie, and I'd like to speak this morning on mental health. For Australians, right, out of... You can't hear?
I'll put it up.
Sorry. There's yours. Okay. Will suffer from mental health at one stage in their life or other. I'm very nervous. Sorry. Too puffed out. I'm the district representative for the area, carer representative. So I'm very much in hands-on with mental health issues. Yeah, and it's growing. The problems are growing. I've got the wrong glasses, let's see.
No doubt.
I think if I wear my own, it'll look better. It's just a bit better. And the suicide rates here, they are high, and they're getting even higher. And harm of our youth, self-harm I mean, is also growing to a terrible proportion. These are all mental health issues. And we have problems in these areas a lot, in that there is discharge from hospitals which are so premature. Can you hear me there? Premature discharge, and where they're put into transitional housing, or they're put in houses which are hospital run, but without the securities there, as you would find in hospital. So these people are terribly vulnerable, and things can get very much out of hand with police and things like that. You know, when they're on a down spiral, and we need a lot more education for mental health in all areas, including that. We have a lot of police who are wonderful. When they come, they're supposed to escort people maybe to hospital. Then there are cases where there's a lot of brute force used on these innocent people, and we need a lot of education going on. So a lot of changes should be happening. Also housing. There's no real housing for these people. They've been thrown out of these institutions and onto the street, and there's hardly any housing going on for them. And what they have is transitional housing, supported accommodation, which is always very short term. And then they're out on the streets again. So they've got problems anyway, and this is added stresses to their life. So and education again is the important thing here, because people don't sort of understand the needs. I don't know what I want to say.
Would you like to take a couple of questions?
Yes,
Perhaps
anybody?
if anybody has a question to ask. One interesting figure just come up to the mic, one interesting figure I read recently was that between 1993 and 2003, that 10-year period, the prison population in Australia increased by 50%. Now that is alarming and quite amazing. Have you noted that sort of thing?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, sure. Question, please, Mark.
What do you think are the main causes to such a disaster, and what are the solutions then?
As in the prison side of it, or Simply mental health, general mental health.
Well, the presence is a reflection of the mental health.
Yes.
So mental health.
Yeah, I think because you sort of...
I work in the industry too, so
Yep. Yeah.
I believe there's not enough support structure. We've created a society that isolates itself, and everyone's an individual, but everything revolves around one individual rather than the whole community, and so there's no support structure. There's very little understanding about mental health, and in the last 30 odd years, drugs and substance abuse, I include even alcohol in that, since I work for Drug Arm at the present, and I can get you some stats, has been a major factor in triggering mental illnesses. Marijuana and speed are one of the highest triggering agents for mental health. And if you have a genetic dispensation for schizophrenia or bipolar, if one smoke might do the job. You'll never come back. In the old days, the hippies used to say it was a bad trip, but now we start to understand what it is. It triggers a gene in the system and brings it out, which might lie dormant forever. Unfortunately, these new substances that are coming up the market today are extremely. This is a big factor, and the other factor is the stress pressures that are around here and the demands to produce. I believe that our welfare system needs to have a complete new overall look at the way we manage things. There's a question there.
Yes, I have a question.
Could you come up to the microphone, please? That way we get it recorded so other people listening to the tapes can hear.
Are you really surprised about...
Just stand back a bit, it's popping.
Are you really surprised about the situation in mental health and the society is finding itself today, not only in Australia but in the whole Western world? Were there not people in the early 70s predicting this whole situation?
Thank you. Yes.
I think 70s was a highly experimental stage in psychology, and the wise seers probably predicted something like that. But people thought that they were experimenting things, and today we have almost a second generation of the residue effects of what happened in the 70s. So yes, you're right. There was a certain amount of prediction, but it was taken too lightly. In fact, society was experimenting with psychology.
It still is.
It still is.
Yes, indeed. And your question, we'll make this the last one. Thanks very much.
When somebody's actually been through the system and then they're discharged and not quite well, I'm speaking from a friend's experience, not mine, with family. How do you get that person help from a family's perspective when they're actually being told that it has to be the person who has the problem to ask for help when mentally they're maybe not in that position to make that judgment?
Yeah, good question. There are government-funded community organizations that are trying to fill the gap, but the gap is too huge and the resources are too small. So quite often people who come out of the hospital, they may be put into a transition home if there is room available. If not, they're sent back. They're sent back to the family, completely psychotic. They might have a slight reduction in their psychosis. They're sent back, and the person has a relapse, and things get worse, and it snowballs. And the solution is more staff, more community houses open, more education, and awareness and of mental health.
Yes, sorry, can I say something? Yes, I had a friend who was, when I was living in Mackay in the 70s, and he was a psychiatrist, and he predicted then that our mental health... he predicted then that our mental health was going to go down then. And he was classed as radical because he used to run group therapies and things like that, which were absolutely wonderful in Mackay, but of course everyone didn't want to know.
And they're just bringing that in now. Now it's the...
He was doing it in the 70s, and the hierarchy did not want to know about him when he was classed as radical. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. But
thank you very much indeed. All right, so let's thank Marie Etoji. We've also a minister like her husband, and we'll actually, Percy is going to give us a talk now on welfare. Leads into that beautifully.
I think I may have sort of a little bit of knowledge to sort of impart here. When I came in 77, a person who was unemployed could survive. A small family of about 3 could survive, or 4 could survive on the so-called dole. I hate that term, but yeah, people could survive on it. Today, we're dealing with people who say they get about $350, $400 a fortnight. They cannot hire a house. You can never get your dole to pay for rent. You cannot even find a caravan park. SP Caravan Park, I think the prices start from $150 a week. There goes your whole dole amount. You cannot survive, and that gap's becoming wider and wider. Taxes have gone up, and we are sort of getting immune to people who are getting poorer. And I really believe that it was the job of the church to look after the welfare of the community, and somewhere churches, including ours, has failed. You see? And I was told that historically it was given to the church to run the social welfare in Australia, but I think there were so many factions and divisions and we still existed, and that wasn't taken up. And of course the world does it in a slightly different way, where there's stigma attached rather than compassion. And today I believe that employment, what we see is the employment figures that we see. I'm not very sure of these figures. For example, I am in a program called the Personal Support Program, which takes up clients that Centrelink refer who have what they call non-vocational barriers, which means barriers that are going to hinder their ability to work. So they don't want to give them disability support pension. They send them to us to work on all the psychological issues and all the issues that they have, and then we pass them on. We have them for 2 years. And if they take part in our program compulsorily, or any sort of Centrelink approved activity, they are deemed to be employed. If you do work for the dole, you're deemed to be employed. You see, if you're doing 15 hours a week, you're deemed to be full-time employed. If Centrelink has got records that you worked for 3 months, 13 weeks at 15 hours a week, your dole will be cut because you're deemed to be employed full-time. And in the last maybe 10 years, there's been a lot of labor hire companies that have come in, and it benefits them to give one person's job to 2 people, and they make more money that way. So today, what you see in your real employment figures are sort of not real employment figures, at least in my perspective of things. And what you see is a lot of underemployment. We've got a huge amount of underemployment, and so this widens the gap between the rich and the poor, and which increases the load on social welfare organizations like ours and churches. Food bank has now become a profit-making industry because of that. And it was never meant to be that. You know, organizations buy food from food bank and then they go and sell it and make tons of money out of it. And that's not what it's all about. We have to relook at the whole social welfare structure. We have to relook at the whole employment structure, I believe. And let's be honest with one another. And I think the whole society has to be involved in this. The whole community has to be involved in even if we can organize some sort of co-ops and things like that, because I believe it's going to get worse. If there's no change, I believe the welfare system is going to get worse. I have a minister friend who actually comes to our fellowship. He feeds about 400 people out of, somehow juggles funds, and he's not funded by the government, and he's been doing that consistently every week. And hats off for him, and I reckon, and the ones we're seeing in those queues are not necessarily street people now. We're seeing middle class people being homeless on the street today because of the way things are. Any questions?
Sure, if you have some questions. I mean, this really is a very good opportunity to get your questions answered. If you just stand up to the mic, please, sir. Thank you.
It's not so much a question, but a concept. I believe that the government should allow small co-ops, very small co-ops of housing, for up to say 6 people at a time to register to go and to rent a home. In other words, if you had 6 people all paying $50 a week, it's a lot better than one person having to pay $300 a week. So it should be illegal and legally binding. In other words, you go in there and say, right, we're going to do this for 12 months, those 6 names, and that will be $50 each. The government says that will be $50 each for the $300 house. It doesn't have to be a government house at all, it can be private. But at least it is a guaranteed income for the 12 months, and it's a guaranteed fact that the 6 people will have somewhere to live.
Thank you. Percy, your comments on that?
Right now, to do that, you have to get special zoning permission to have a boarding house zoning set up, and then there are lots of public liability issues and all sorts of other things. Well, I agree with you. You need to relax that. And
yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And your question, please.
My question is, this social and economic unravelling, do you think that is just a natural progression, or do you think there's been intent?
Look, this is a question that I am not in the power to answer, because I can give you basically an opinion, but it may not be true. My opinion is, I think there was a planned intent. However, I may be wrong. So it's a question that I just stand with my opinion, but it's not grounded as fact.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. Percy Edjurji, please. Would John Coyle please come up? And there are a lot of problems. A lot more people are going